In the heart of Wyoming, a wild chestnut stallion named Blaze terrified every cowboy who dared to tame him. No rope could hold him, no rider could stay on. Thomas Miller was ready to end the horse's life, until a boy no older than 9 appeared, carrying nothing but a sketchbook and a secret that would unravel an entire family. What happened next would shake the ranch and heal broken hearts. The wind swept across the wide plains of Wyoming, carrying with it the dry scent of hay and dust from the summer heat. On the Miller Ranch, every sound seemed to echo: the slam of a barn door, the clink of metal stirrups, the sharp whinny of a horse. But there was one sound that unsettled everyone: the pounding hooves of a chestnut stallion named Blaze. His coat shimmered with a fiery red hue in the sun, his mane whipped like flames in the wind, and a thin white blaze streaked down his forehead like a mark of lightning. Blaze was a storm contained in flesh and bone. Every cowboy who had tried to break him had failed miserably. He reared against ropes, snapped wooden rails, and sent even the strongest riders tumbling into the dirt. To some, he was dangerous. To others, cursed. But to Thomas Miller, the 62-year-old ranch owner, Blaze was a burden he could no longer shoulder. From the porch of his ranch house, Thomas watched the stallion slam his hooves into the corral gate, sparks of dust rising each time. His jaw tightened beneath his gray mustache, and his eyes, weathered by decades of sun, held the quiet weight of a decision he wished he didn't have to make. "Tom," said Evelyn, his wife, stepping onto the porch with a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her voice carried the patience of a woman who had shared his life for 40 years. "You've dealt with tough horses before. Maybe he just needs more time." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Time won't change what's in his eyes. He's not just wild, Evie. He's dangerous. He'll kill someone if we let this go on." From the corral, Blaze let out a shrill cry, tossing his head so violently that his dark mane lashed across his neck. Several ranch hands stood nearby, ropes slack in their hands, but none dared step closer. They had already seen what Blaze could do. Jake Turner, the young cowboy with a stubborn pride, still nursed bruises from his last attempt. Even Jake, who had once boasted he could ride any beast in the West, now avoided the stallion's gaze. The ranch had always been a place of order. Cattle grazing in tidy herds, horses trained for rodeos and ranch work, every animal fitting neatly into the life Thomas had built. But Blaze was disorder, defiance in its purest form, a scar of chaos against the discipline Thomas demanded. And the ranch was paying the price. Cattle spooked when Blaze screamed, riders hesitated, and whispers spread through town that the Miller Ranch was losing its edge. Thomas drew a slow breath, heavy as the late summer air. "Tomorrow morning, I'll call Dr. Harris. It's time to put an end to this." Evelyn stiffened. Her fingers tightened on his arm. "You can't mean that." "He's still young, Tom. Strong. Maybe too strong for his own good, but I've been around horses longer than most men live," Thomas cut in, his voice gravelly. "And I've never seen one like him." There's no trust in his eyes. Just fire. He paused, staring at the stallion's restless pacing. That kind of fire burns everything around it. The silence between them grew heavier than the sky before a storm. Evelyn's heart ached at the finality in her husband's tone. She had seen him gentle mustangs with nothing but patience, had watched him mend broken bones and broken spirits. But this time, Something deeper weighed on him. Something she couldn't name. The sun dipped lower, painting the fields in a wash of amber light. Blaze halted at the far end of the corral, sides heaving, nostrils flaring. For a moment, his gaze lifted toward the porch, locking eyes with Thomas. The stallion's stare was fierce, unyielding, but underneath the wildness there was something else. A flicker of pain, like a memory no one could touch. Thomas turned away first. "Tomorrow," he repeated under his breath, though his voice cracked slightly. "Tomorrow ends this." Evelyn pressed her lips together, hiding the tears that welled in her eyes. The cicadas began their steady hum, and the smell of sage drifted across the porch. She wanted to believe, wanted to plead again, but she knew the man beside her. Once Thomas Miller set his jaw, it was like stone against the river. Nothing moved it. Yet as the evening deepened, Evelyn couldn't shake the image of Blaze's eyes. The fury, yes, but also the grief hidden behind it. She whispered a silent prayer that something, someone, might arrive before morning to change her husband's mind. The stallion screamed once more into the twilight, a sound that seemed to carry far beyond the ranch, over the rolling hills, into the unknown. And though Thomas didn't know it yet, that cry was not a farewell. It was a call. Morning came with a sky brushed in pale orange and the faint chill of Wyoming dawn. The ranch stirred early, the smell of coffee and dust mingling as men gathered around the corral. All eyes rested on the fiery chestnut stallion. Blaze pawed the dirt with restless energy, each stomp a warning, each breath steaming in the cool air. His reddish coat gleamed like polished copper under the sun, his mane whipping across his neck as if flames had taken root there. Among the gathered hands was Jake Turner, the young cowboy, whose pride had been wounded, but not destroyed. Jake was no stranger to rodeos, nor to danger. His body still carried the bruises from his last encounter with Blaze, but his pride outweighed his pain. He adjusted the brim of his hat, jaw clenched tight, determined to prove himself. The whispers from the men around him, doubting his skill, mocking his failure, stung worse than the bruises ever could. "Let me try again," Jake said, stepping forward, his voice sharp with defiance. "I know I can handle him." Thomas Miller's eyes narrowed beneath his hat. He respected courage, but he had lived long enough to know the line between courage and recklessness. "Jake," he replied with the weight of authority, "that horse nearly broke your back last time. He's not one you win over with muscle." Jake's lips twisted into a smirk that didn't quite hide his anger. "With all due respect, sir, I don't intend to use muscle. I intend to use grit." He tipped his hat and moved toward the corral gate before Thomas could argue further. The men shifted uneasily. Some crossed their arms, others whispered bets, though none believed Jake could do what no one else had. Blaze had thrown seasoned ranchers, snapped ropes like twigs, and left more than one cowboy limping for weeks. Still, pride is a dangerous fire, and Jake carried it burning inside him. The corral gate creaked open. Blaze's ears pinned back instantly, his muscles coiled like a spring. The air itself seemed to tighten. Jake stepped inside with deliberate calm, his boots crunching against the dirt, lariat looped in his hand. He tried to mask his nerves, but his shoulders betrayed the stiffness of fear. Blaze fixed his gaze on the intruder, eyes sharp and wild. "Easy now," Jake muttered, circling slowly. "You're not the first Mustang I've seen." But Blaze wasn't like the others. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring, then erupted forward without warning. The stallion lunged with terrifying speed, forcing Jake to leap sideways. The crowd gasped as Blaze reared, hooves slamming the air where Jake had stood moments before. Dust exploded upward, catching the light like sparks. Jake scrambled to his feet, rope at the ready, and swung the loop wide. For an instant, it seemed he might catch the stallion. But Blaze twisted mid-stride, faster than instinct, faster than thought. The rope fell uselessly against the dirt. The stallion bucked, back legs lashing out, and Jake stumbled backward, barely missing a blow that could have shattered bone. "Get out of there!" one of the hands shouted, gripping the fence. But Jake refused. Shame burned hotter than fear. He charged again, swinging the rope with desperate force. Blaze's eyes flared with something almost like contempt. He pivoted sharply, driving Jake back against the rails. The young cowboy's hat flew off as Blaze's hooves struck the wooden post, the crack echoing like a rifle shot. Splinters rained across Jake's shoulder. "Enough!" Thomas barked, stepping forward. His voice cut through the chaos, but Blaze didn't stop. The stallion wheeled again, circling Jake like a predator. Jake tried one final throw, but his hand shook and the loop faltered. Blaze lunged, and Jake dropped the rope entirely, diving aside into the dirt. He rolled, scrambled, and barely slipped through the gate as two ranch hands yanked it open. The corral slammed shut behind him. Jake collapsed to his knees in the dust, chest heaving, face pale beneath the grime. Around him, the men were silent, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down. Blaze stood tall in the center of the corral, chest rising and falling like a drumbeat, mane whipping, victorious. Thomas exhaled slowly, his expression hard as weathered stone. He walked toward Jake, not with anger, but with a disappointment heavier than any scolding. "Son," he said quietly, "there are some fires you can't fight. You can only respect them, or burn." Jake's jaw trembled, but pride forced him to look up. His eyes were glassy, fury and humiliation locked together. "I would have had him if you'd given me more time." Thomas studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "No, Jake. You would have been broken, same as every man before you. That horse isn't yours to conquer." Jake rose shakily to his feet, brushing dirt from his shirt, though it did nothing to hide the trembling in his hands. He wanted to argue, but the truth pressed in from every side. Blaze had beaten him cleanly, utterly, and the sting of failure was worse than the ache in his ribs. The ranch hands muttered among themselves as Jake limped away. Pride can be stubborn, but humiliation leaves scars deeper than bruises. Thomas remained by the corral, gaze locked on the stallion who still tossed his head defiantly. Evelyn joined him quietly, her hands folded together, her face pale. "He'll never be tamed," Thomas said finally, his voice raw. "I've seen enough. Tomorrow, Evie. Tomorrow it ends." Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. She knew her husband well enough to hear the finality in his tone. And yet, as the sun climbed higher and the stallion stood gleaming in the corral, she felt an unease she couldn't name. Something in Blaze's stare, wild yet wounded, suggested that his story was far from over. The air hung heavy with silence, broken only by the restless stamping of hooves. And in that silence, Evelyn whispered to herself, though Thomas did not hear. Maybe tomorrow won't come the way you think." The sun had dipped low over the Wyoming horizon, painting the fields in muted gold as the Miller Ranch settled into uneasy quiet. The day's dust still clung to the boots of the men who had witnessed Jake's humiliation in the corral. No one spoke of it aloud, but the memory lingered. Blaze standing proud in victory. The young cowboy crumpled in defeat. By evening, the ranch felt heavier, as if the land itself carried the weight of Thomas Miller's unspoken resolve. Inside the ranch house, the air smelled of stew simmering slowly on the stove. Evelyn moved quietly through the kitchen, her hands busy, though her mind wandered back to the corral. She had watched Jake fail and fall, and though she pitied the boy's pride, what haunted her most was the stallion's eyes. Wild, yes, but filled with something more, something that pressed against her heart like a whisper she couldn't decipher. Thomas sat at the dining table, shoulders slumped beneath the fading light of a single oil lamp. His hat lay beside him, its brim worn smooth from years of work. He rubbed at his temples, silent, while Evelyn placed a bowl before him. The clink of spoon against porcelain was the only sound until he finally spoke. "Tomorrow, I'll call Harris," he said, voice low, steady. Evelyn froze mid-motion. She had known this was coming, had heard it in his tone earlier, but the finality of the words still struck her like a blow. She sat down opposite him, eyes searching his weathered face. "Tom, you can't." Not like this. His gaze lifted, gray and stern beneath furrowed brows. "I can and I must. That horse is a danger to every man who sets foot in that corral. He's not just wild, Evie. He's broken." She shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. "He's not broken. He's hurting. There's a difference." You, of all people, should see that Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair. He looked older in that moment, the years etched deep in his skin. "I've given him every chance. Jake's not the first, and he won't be the last. Each time ends the same. A man limping away, lucky to be alive. You think I don't see the pain in that horse? I do. But pain doesn't change the fact that he'll kill someone." Silence filled the space between them, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Evelyn folded her hands tightly in her lap, fighting the urge to argue further. She knew the ranch meant order to Thomas, and Blaze was chaos incarnate. Yet she also knew the man before her, the same man who had once spent an entire winter nursing a foal back from the brink when everyone else had given up. The same man who had taught her that no creature was beyond hope. Later that night, Thomas stepped onto the porch, pipe in hand. The sky was vast, scattered with stars that seemed close enough to touch. From the corral drifted the restless sounds of Blaze, the steady pacing, the sharp snort of breath. Thomas leaned against the railing, staring out into the darkness. He felt Evelyn's presence beside him before she spoke. "You remember Dusty?" she asked softly, naming the Mustang Thomas had once tamed years ago. He let out a faint laugh, bitter at the memory. Dusty was wild, but he had trust in him. "Took time, but I saw it in his eyes." Blaze. Blaze has none of that. Just fire and fear. "Maybe you're not the one meant to reach him," Evelyn said. Her voice was almost a whisper, yet it struck Thomas deep. "Maybe it's not about you at all." Thomas didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the corral where Blaze's chestnut coat glimmered faintly in the starlight. The stallion lifted his head, as if sensing the eyes upon him. For a brief second, their gazes locked. Something flickered there, too fleeting to name, before Blaze snorted and turned away. By morning, Thomas's decision was set. At breakfast, he stood in the doorway, boots laced tight, hat in hand. "I'll ride into town and call Harris when I get back." By noon tomorrow, Blaze will be gone. His words were flat, unyielding. Evelyn didn't respond, but her heart rebelled against them. She watched him walk away, her chest heavy with sorrow. She whispered a prayer under her breath, not for Thomas, not even for herself, but for the horse who carried both fury and grief in his eyes. The ranch bustled with its usual rhythm that day, but an undercurrent of tension hummed beneath every task. Men avoided looking at the corral, where Blaze paced endlessly, his hooves striking the dirt with restless defiance. Even Jake, usually so loud and brash, kept to himself, his pride wounded too deeply for words. That evening, Thomas sat alone again on the porch. The land stretched wide and silent, shadows creeping long across the fields. His decision weighed heavy, but he clung to it with the stubbornness that had carried him through a lifetime on the ranch. He thought of the years spent building this life, of the order he had fought to maintain. Blaze threatened all of that. Ending it was the only way, or so he told himself. As the last light bled from the horizon, a sound drifted faintly across the fields. The distant creak of a bicycle wheel on gravel, growing closer, accompanied by the soft hum of tires against dirt. Thomas frowned, leaning forward. Few ever came down the ranch road uninvited. The sound drew nearer, breaking the evening hush. Evelyn stepped onto the porch beside him, her brow furrowed. "Who would be coming this late?" Thomas shook his head, watching as a figure emerged along the road. A child, riding a battered bicycle, hat too large for his head, a satchel bouncing against his side. Behind him followed a woman walking quickly to keep pace. The boy's small frame seemed fragile against the vastness of the plains, yet his posture was straight, his pedaling steady, his eyes fixed ahead with a purpose that belied his years. Blaze let out a sharp whinny from the corral, ears pricked, muscles taut. He had sensed them too. Thomas narrowed his eyes as the boy dismounted, dust rising around him. The child's gaze drifted past everything else. The ranch house, the men, the wide fields, until it landed on the stallion. Blaze froze, nostrils flaring, as if some unseen thread connected them across the distance. The air thickened, a silence stretching taut. Thomas felt something shift, though he couldn't name it. Evelyn's hand found his arm, squeezing gently. The boy tipped his hat politely, his voice clear in the quiet evening. "Sir, are you the owner of that horse?" Thomas's heart stilled. The question carried more weight than the boy could possibly know. The evening air was heavy with silence as the boy stood at the gate, dust settling around the wheels of his old bicycle. His hat, far too large for his head, slipped forward, shadowing a pair of clear blue eyes that seemed to look past everyone and everything, except the chestnut stallion pacing in the corral. Blaze halted mid-stride, ears pricked, nostrils wide, staring back as if he recognized the boy. The other ranch hands exchanged glances, shifting uneasily. Horses didn't freeze like that, not without a reason. Thomas Miller, still seated on the porch, studied the boy with the wary eye of a man who had spent his life measuring strangers. The woman who followed, the boy's aunt, by the look of her, wore a tired expression, her apron still dusted with flour from her shift at the diner in town. She stopped a few paces behind, breathing heavily, as if embarrassed to have been dragged here. The boy straightened his back, holding his hat in both hands now, and spoke with a politeness that contrasted sharply with the boldness in his words. "Sir, I came for that horse." The ranch yard went silent, Even the cicadas seemed to pause their song. The men leaned against the fence, skeptical grins tugging at their mouths. Jake Turner, still sore from his defeat, let out a sharp laugh. "You? That horse nearly killed me, kid. He'll tear you apart before you can blink." But the boy didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Blaze, steady and sure. "He's not mean," he said quietly. "He's scared. I can help him." Thomas rose slowly from his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. He stepped down the porch steps, boots sinking into the dirt, and approached the boy. The ranch hands expected him to send the child away, but something in the old man's gaze was different. Half caution, half curiosity. "What's your name, son?" Thomas asked, his voice rough. "Ethan Parker," the boy replied without hesitation. His voice was clear, unwavering, though his hands tightened on his hat brim. "And what makes you think you can do what grown men can't?" Thomas's tone was even, though his words carried weight. Ethan glanced once more at Blaze, then back at Thomas. "Because I've seen him before. In my dreams. For weeks now. I know he isn't bad. He's just waiting for someone to listen." The ranch hands chuckled uneasily, whispering among themselves. Dreams? It sounded foolish. But Evelyn, standing quietly on the porch, felt a chill run through her. She had prayed for something, anything, to change the path her husband had chosen. Now, here was this boy, speaking with a conviction far too deep for his age. Mary, the woman who had come with him, finally stepped forward. "I told him it was nonsense," she said quickly, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "But he wouldn't let it go. He said he had to come here. I'm sorry if he's causing trouble." Thomas regarded her for a long moment before turning back to Ethan. The boy's face was thin, his clothes worn and patched, but his eyes were bright, alive, as if they carried a fire that mirrored the stallion's. Blaze snorted suddenly, pawing the ground, but he did not charge. Instead, he stood at the edge of the corral, neck stretched, watching Ethan with a stillness none of the men had ever seen. Jake muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." But even he couldn't tear his eyes from the sight. Thomas's jaw tightened. Everything in him told him this was foolish, dangerous. And yet, he couldn't ignore the way the horse had changed the moment the boy appeared. Blaze was still fire, but his flames flickered differently now. "You don't know what you're asking," Thomas said finally. "That horse isn't a friend. He's a storm that'll swallow you whole." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Maybe storms just need someone who isn't afraid to walk through them." The words struck deeper than Thomas expected. He was reminded suddenly of a time long ago when his own daughter had said something similar, when she had begged to keep a foal no one thought would survive. He pushed the thought aside quickly, burying it under years of silence. The boy took a hesitant step closer to the fence, his hand tightening around the brim of his hat. Blaze's ears flicked forward, his body tense, but not hostile. The stallion's eyes followed Ethan with unnerving intensity, as if the boy carried some unspoken key. Mary reached out, grabbing Ethan's shoulder. "That's enough," she hissed. "We're leaving." Now, but Ethan didn't move. His voice was quiet, but resolute. "Please, sir. Just let me try once. If I'm wrong, I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." The yard held its breath. The men shifted uncomfortably, torn between laughter and unease. Evelyn's hands clutched the porch rail, her heart pounding. Thomas stared at the boy, the firelight of the stallion reflected in those clear blue eyes. And though he wanted to say no, though every instinct screamed against it, something in him faltered. He thought of Blaze's eyes that morning, filled not only with rage, but with a pain he couldn't name. And now here was this boy, carrying the same unyielding certainty he once recognized in his daughter. Thomas's voice came out low, almost reluctant. "One chance, but you'll stay by me. The first sign of danger, you run. Understand?" Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, relief shining in his eyes. "Yes, sir." "Just one chance is all I need from the corral." Blaze let out a long, low breath, as though the stallion himself had heard, and agreed. Morning broke over the ranch in a blaze of orange and red, the kind of sunrise that seemed to set the plains on fire. Dew clung to the grass, and the air smelled sharp with sage and dust. The ranch hands gathered around the corral, whispers curling between them like smoke. Word had already spread. The strange boy who came on a battered bicycle had convinced Thomas Miller to give him a chance with the wild chestnut stallion. No one quite believed it, yet none dared miss the spectacle. Blaze stood restless in the corral, his reddish coat gleaming like copper beneath the rising sun. He pawed at the dirt, tossing his head, nostrils flaring as if he knew something unusual was about to happen. His dark eyes flicked from man to man until they found the small figure standing at the gate. Ethan Parker clutched his oversized hat in one hand, his sketchbook in the other, his thin shoulders straight despite the weight of so many eyes. Thomas loomed nearby, stern and watchful, his hand resting on the latch of the gate. Evelyn stood just behind him, her heart tight with worry. Mary, pale and anxious, gripped her nephew's shoulder and whispered frantically for him to reconsider. But Ethan shook his head. His voice was steady, almost eerily calm for a child. "I'm not afraid, Aunt Mary. He won't hurt me." Jake Turner leaned against the fence, arms crossed, his pride still raw from his own failure. "This is madness," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If that horse won't take me, he sure as hell won't take a kid." But though his words dripped with scorn, his eyes never left Blaze. Thomas's voice cut through the murmurs, gravelly and firm. "Remember what I said. One sign of danger, and you run. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." The gate creaked as Thomas swung it open, the sound echoing across the hushed yard. Ethan stepped inside, the dirt crunching softly beneath his worn shoes. For a long moment, nothing moved. Blaze stood like a statue, ears pricked, every muscle taut. The men held their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But Ethan didn't rush forward. He simply stood there, a few feet inside the corral, lowering his sketchbook slowly to the ground. He spoke softly, words no one else could quite catch. His voice carried a rhythm, gentle as wind through tall grass. The boy's hat slipped lower over his brow, shadowing his face, but his eyes never left Blaze's. The stallion snorted, tossing his head once, twice. His hooves struck the ground with warning, but he didn't charge. Instead, he inched sideways, watching the boy as though trying to solve a puzzle. Ethan took a single step closer, slow and deliberate, his hands open at his sides. Thomas's fingers tightened on the rail. Every instinct told him to pull the boy out, to stop this before it turned bloody. But something rooted him in place, the same something that held every man silent along the fence. Ethan whispered again, "You're not bad." You're just scared?" The words reached Blaze, though no one could explain how. The stallion's ears flicked forward, his breathing slowed. He took one hesitant step toward the boy, then another. Dust rose in tiny puffs beneath his hooves. The yard was so quiet, the creak of the leather saddle slung over the rail sounded like thunder. Evelyn clutched the rail, her knuckles white. Jake's mouth fell open. The boy raised one hand, palm outward, not forcing, not demanding, only offering. Blaze's chest heaved, his breath washing hot across the air between them. Then, impossibly, he lowered his head. The stallion's muzzle brushed the boy's outstretched fingers. Gasps broke the silence. One of the ranch hands cursed under his breath, unable to believe his eyes. Evelyn's tears spilled freely. Even Thomas, hardened by decades of ranch life, felt something crack deep inside him. He had seen men risk their lives. He had seen Mustangs broken with ropes and force. But never this. Never a horse choosing trust on his own. Ethan's lips curved in a faint smile. He murmured something else, his fingers brushing Blaze's blaze of white down his forehead. The stallion closed his eyes briefly, as though savoring the touch. It was not surrender. It was recognition. The moment shattered when Blaze suddenly lifted his head, startled by the cry of a hawk overhead. His muscles bunched, his body twisting, and for an instant it seemed he might rear again. Thomas lurched forward, ready to yank the boy out, but Ethan only pressed his hand against Blaze's neck and whispered, "It's all right. I'm here." To everyone's shock, the stallion steadied. His hooves settled back into the dirt, his ears flicking, his breathing evening out. The wild fire in his eyes dimmed to a glowing ember. Silence held for a long time before Thomas finally stepped into the corral. His boots crunched against the dirt as he stopped beside the boy, his gaze locked on the horse who had once seemed untouchable. He looked down at Ethan, then back at Blaze, disbelief warring with something he had not felt in years. Hope. "You've done the impossible," Thomas said quietly, though the words were meant for himself as much as the boy. Ethan shook his head. Not impossible. He just needed someone to listen. The ranch yard buzzed with whispers, men exchanging stunned glances. Jake turned away, shame and jealousy battling in his chest. Evelyn pressed her hand to her mouth, her heart overflowing. Thomas placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, firm but not unkind. "This changes things," he admitted, though his voice was heavy. "But it raises more questions than it answers." Ethan looked up at him, his young face solemn beneath the oversized hat. "Then maybe it's time to start asking the right ones." Blaze let out a deep breath, leaning his head slightly against the boy, as though sealing some silent pact. Around them, the world seemed to hold still. The ranch, the men, even the wind. For the first time since Blaze had arrived, the storm inside the stallion had quieted. And for Thomas Miller, a man who believed he had seen everything, it was the beginning of something he could not yet name, but knew would change his life forever. The ranch was never truly quiet. Even at night there were the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of wood settling in the barns, the restless shifting of horses in their stalls. Yet that evening, after the boy's hand had touched Blaze's muzzle without blood or chaos, the ranch fell into a silence so deep it unsettled everyone who lived there. The ranch hands kept their distance, whispering in the bunkhouse, replaying what they had seen. Some insisted it was luck. Others swore the boy must have some strange gift. Jake Turner sat in the corner, nursing his pride like an open wound, the sting of humiliation sharper now that a child had succeeded where he had failed. He muttered to himself that the horse must have been tired, distracted. But he didn't believe his own words. Inside the Miller house, Thomas sat at the head of the long oak table, staring into a glass of untouched whiskey. The lamplight flickered across his weathered face, highlighting lines carved by years of sun and responsibility. Evelyn sat across from him, her hands folded, her eyes full of unspoken questions. Between them stretched a silence heavier than any argument. Finally, Evelyn broke it. "You saw it, Tom. You saw the way Blaze looked at him, like he'd been waiting for that boy." Thomas exhaled through his nose, slow and reluctant. "I saw it. Doesn't mean I understand it. Doesn't mean it's safe." He rubbed at his jaw, staring past the glass into memories that pressed at the edges of his mind. "I've spent my life breaking horses, Evie. I know their language. That wasn't the language of surrender. It was something else." "Maybe surrender isn't what Blaze needs," Evelyn said softly. "Maybe he needs someone who doesn't see him as a battle to win." Thomas frowned, unsettled by the thought. He remembered the boy's words. "You're not bad. You're just scared." Words simple enough, yet they carried the weight of something Thomas himself had never dared admit about the stallion. Fear had always been in Blaze's eyes, but Thomas had only seen danger. Outside, the boy sat on the porch steps, sketchbook balanced on his knees. Ethan's pencil scratched lightly across the paper, the lines forming the stallion's proud head, the blaze of white down his forehead, the dark eyes that seemed to know more than they should. Mary hovered nearby, arms crossed tightly, her face drawn with worry. She kept glancing toward the corral, where Blaze stood quiet for the first time in weeks, head lowered, as if listening to the night. "Ethan, enough of this foolishness," Mary whispered harshly. "You had your chance." "We're leaving tomorrow." The boy didn't look up. "He doesn't want me to leave. I can feel it." Mary's mouth pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, but she'd seen it too, the impossible calm when Ethan had touched the horse. And deep down, she feared what it might mean. The night stretched on. Thomas stepped onto the porch, the screen door groaning shut behind him. He stood for a moment, staring at the boy hunched over his sketches, the stallion in the distance, and the way the two seemed connected by an invisible thread. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words stuck. Instead, he asked, "Why him? Why now?" Ethan looked up, his young face solemn in the moonlight. "Because he was waiting. And so were you." Thomas's heart stilled at the words. They were too heavy for a child, too precise, as if echoing something from his own buried past. He turned away quickly, retreating into silence once more. In the corral, Blaze shifted, letting out a low rumble that sounded almost like approval. The ranch slept uneasily, wrapped in a quiet that felt like the calm before another storm. The following morning rose gray and cool, the sky covered in thin clouds that muted the light. The ranch usually stirred with the noise of cattle and men calling to one another, but this day felt different. There was an uneasy hush in the air, as if the land itself waited for something to be revealed. Blaze stood still in the corral, ears flicking, eyes watchful. He was no longer the storm of hooves and rage he had been when he first arrived. Instead, he lingered near the rails, head raised toward the ranch house, as though waiting for the boy. Ethan emerged with his sketchbook tucked under his arm, Mary close behind him, her expression weary. She had not slept much, haunted by the strange events of the night before. She tugged gently at the boy's sleeve. "We should go back, Ethan. This place, it isn't for us." But Ethan shook his head, his gaze already fixed on Blaze. "It is for me. I know it. He's part of me somehow." The words unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She wanted to argue, but before she could, Thomas appeared on the porch, his broad frame filling the doorway. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept either, his eyes shadowed, his jaw tight. Evelyn stood a step behind him, her face full of quiet worry. "Mrs. Parker," Thomas said, addressing Mary with a formal politeness that surprised her. "I'd like a word." Mary stiffened, instinctively drawing Ethan closer to her side. "About what?" "About why you came here," Thomas replied. His voice carried no anger, only the weight of something unsaid. The boy looked up at his aunt. "Tell him, Aunt Mary." "Please," Mary's lips pressed together. She shook her head. "It's not your business, Mr. Miller. We just came because he insisted. That's all." But Thomas didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze was steady, piercing in the way only a man who had seen too much could manage. "That horse didn't arrive here by chance. And that boy didn't either. You know something. I can see it plain." The silence between them thickened until Evelyn stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Mary, whatever you're holding back, keeping it hidden will only make things worse. For the boy, for the horse, for all of us." Mary's composure faltered. She looked away toward the hills, her throat working as though she were swallowing words she had carried for years. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "Emily, that's why we're here." The name struck Thomas like a blow. His breath caught, his hands curling at his sides. It had been years since anyone had spoken his daughter's name aloud. Mary went on, each word pulled from a place of pain. "Emily was Ethan's mother. She's gone now. 2 years. Heart trouble, the doctor said. I've raised him since then." The boy clutched his sketchbook tighter, his eyes wide, as though he hadn't known she would reveal so much. He looked from his aunt to Thomas, confusion swirling in his young face. "My mom, you knew her?" Thomas's chest ached. He swallowed hard before answering. "She was my daughter." Gasps rippled among the ranch hands nearby. Even Evelyn covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. The truth, buried for so long, had surfaced at last. Mary's voice trembled. "She never told you." She didn't think she could. There were too many things, too many regrets. When Blaze came to us, she swore he carried a piece of her past. She kept him until she couldn't anymore. After she passed, I sold him to a trader because I had no way to keep him in town. I never imagined he'd find his way back here. Thomas's eyes closed briefly. Memories flooded him. Emily as a little girl running through the pastures, Emily laughing as she brushed down a foal, Emily defiant the day she left. And now Emily gone, her child standing before him with her same stubborn eyes. Ethan's small voice broke the silence. "So you're my grandfather?" The words pierced Thomas deeper than any accusation. He opened his eyes and looked at the boy, his heart aching with a mix of grief and wonder. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I am." Ethan's lip trembled, but he stood tall, clinging to the stallion's gaze across the yard. Then maybe that's why Blaze knew me. Because he knew her. Because he knew I belonged here. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. All his certainty, all his decisions seemed to crumble. The stallion pawed the dirt once, as though confirming the boy's words. Mary wiped her eyes roughly, ashamed of her tears. I didn't want him to know. Not like this. Not so soon. I wanted to protect him from the weight of it. Evelyn touched her arm gently. Sometimes the truth protects better than silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind carried the smell of dust and pine across the yard, filling the heavy air. Thomas turned toward the corral, his heart breaking and mending all at once. He saw his daughter's spirit in the boy, saw her fire in Blaze's eyes. The storm of secrets had broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The revelation hung over the ranch like a storm cloud that refused to break. Thomas carried the weight of it in silence, his steps slower, his eyes distant. Evelyn moved quietly around him, knowing better than to press too hard, yet she felt the ache in his chest as clearly as if it were her own. For the men who worked the ranch, the story spread quickly, whispered in the bunkhouse and over fence rails. The boy wasn't just some drifter with strange dreams. He was blood, kin to the Miller name. Ethan felt it too, though in a way no child should. He had always sensed there was more to his life than his aunt's weary explanations, but hearing it spoken aloud left him with questions he couldn't untangle. He wandered to the corral that evening, sketchbook tucked under his arm, his thin frame silhouetted against the fading sun. Blaze lifted his head immediately, ears pricked, nostrils flaring, and for a long moment the two simply stared at each other. Without speaking, Ethan slipped between the rails, moving with the same steady patience he had shown before. The stallion shifted, but didn't retreat. Dust rose beneath Ethan's shoes, swirling in the low light, as he approached with a quiet confidence that belonged to someone far older than 9. He reached out his hand again, and Blaze lowered his head, pressing the soft velvet of his muzzle into the boy's palm. It was more than trust. It was recognition. From the porch, Thomas watched, his chest tightening. He remembered Emily at that age, the way she had slipped into pastures against his orders, fearless, certain that every creature could be gentled with kindness. He had scolded her for it, demanded she stay away from horses too wild to trust, yet deep down he had admired her courage. Now her son stood where she once had, unafraid, carrying the same fire in his eyes. You see it, don't you? Evelyn's voice broke into his thoughts, soft but insistent. She had come up beside him without a sound, her gaze fixed on the boy and the stallion. It isn't chance. It's something deeper. They were meant to find each other. Thomas didn't answer. Words seemed too small. In the corral, Ethan pulled his sketchbook from under his arm and opened it with his free hand. The pages fluttered until he found the drawing he'd made the night before. Blaze's proud head, his eyes shaded dark with longing. He held it up so the stallion could see, as though sharing a secret. Blaze snorted, the warm air ruffling the paper, and Ethan laughed. A clear, bright sound that startled the ranch hands leaning against the fence. Jake Turner turned away, unable to watch. Shame burned hotter with every display of trust between the horse and the boy. Yet under his bitterness, a seed of curiosity grew. How could a child succeed where men had failed? He clenched his jaw, unwilling to admit he wanted to know the answer. As the evening deepened, Mary appeared at the fence, her face lined with exhaustion and unease. She had not wanted Ethan here, had not wanted the truth spoken aloud. Now she watched him standing with Blaze, as though they had known each other forever, and her heart twisted. She whispered, half to herself, "Emily, what have you left me with?" Blaze shifted closer to Ethan, his massive body casting the boy in shadow. Ethan reached up and laid his small hand along the stallion's cheek, fingers stroking the fiery coat. No words passed between them, but the bond was undeniable, written in the gentle stillness of the animal and the steady calm of the child. Thomas's throat tightened. He felt both awe and dread. Awe, because the connection was real, unshakable. Dread, because such bonds carried weight of responsibility, weight of destiny. He had already lost one child to her own fierce heart. Could he bear to risk another? The sun sank fully, leaving only the glow of lanterns around the yard. Still, Ethan lingered in the corral, whispering words too soft to catch. Blaze stood beside him, no longer the raging storm, but a sentinel, calm and protective. The ranch hands drifted away, murmuring to each other, leaving only the boy, the horse, and the family who watched from the porch. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice rough. "Bring him in, Ethan. Enough for tonight." The boy turned, his expression unreadable, but he nodded. He patted Blaze's neck once, then slipped back through the rails, closing the sketchbook under his arm. Blaze let out a low rumble, watching him go until the last step. As Ethan approached the porch, Thomas stepped down to meet him. The man's shadow stretched long across the dirt, heavy and uncertain. He looked down at the boy, at the stubborn set of his jaw, and the echoes of Emily in his eyes. "You don't know what you've started," Thomas said quietly. Ethan tilted his head. "Maybe not. But neither do you." The words struck like flint against stone, sparking something deep inside Thomas that he couldn't name. He wanted to deny it, to shut the boy out, but Blaze's calm presence behind them told him the truth. The bond was real, undeniable, and it had already begun to change everything. The night closed around them, filled with unspoken questions. The air changed before the storm came. The ranch hands felt it in their bones as they worked through the heat of the afternoon. The sky grew heavy with clouds that stacked high and black, swallowing the horizon. The smell of rain and electricity seeped into the wind, carrying the promise of something violent. Animals grew restless, cattle bunched tighter in the fields, dogs whined and paced, and Blaze in the corral lifted his head, ears twisting, muscles twitching as though he could feel the pressure building inside the earth itself. Thomas had seen enough Wyoming summers to know what was coming. He strode across the yard, barking orders for the men to secure the barn doors and move the smaller livestock to shelter. Evelyn hurried through the porch gathering laundry, her skirts snapping against her legs in the rising wind. Mary guided Ethan toward the house, but the boy resisted, his eyes fixed on Blaze. "He's scared," Ethan said, voice thin but certain. "He doesn't want to be alone." Mary gripped his arm. "So are we all, Ethan. That doesn't mean you run into danger," but the boy couldn't look away. Blaze pawed the dirt, eyes rolling white, nostrils flaring as thunder rumbled far off. Each crack of sound rippled through his body, setting off tremors of panic. He began to pace, circling the corral like a trapped storm, sweat already darkening his fiery coat. By the time the first flash of lightning split the sky, Blaze was in a frenzy. He reared, slamming his hooves against the rails, the sound echoing like gunshots. The men cursed and backed away, ropes slipping through their hands. One shouted, "He'll break the fence!" Thomas grabbed for a lead rope, but Evelyn's cry stopped him. "Tom, don't!" "You'll be crushed." The rain came in sudden sheets, cold and heavy, plastering hair and clothes to skin. The wind tore across the yard, carrying dust and hay, rattling the barn doors. Blaze's screams cut through it all, sharp and wild, each one tearing at the night. He reared again, striking the top rail, splintering the wood. The fence groaned under the assault. Before anyone could stop him, Ethan broke free from Mary's grip. The boy dashed through the rain, straight toward the corral. "Ethan!" Mary's scream was lost in the storm. The men lunged to grab him, but he was too quick, slipping between arms and mud-slick ground. He climbed the rails and dropped inside just as Blaze wheeled, the stallion's hooves cutting the air dangerously close. Thomas's heart seized. For a moment, the world slowed. The boy, small and fragile, standing before a beast in full fury, lightning carving the sky. Rain pounding so hard it blurred the edges of sight. Then Ethan spoke. His voice was low, steady, though soaked and shaking. "Blaze. It's okay. I'm here." The stallion froze, sides heaving, steam rising from his body despite the rain. His ears flicked forward, catching the boy's voice even as thunder cracked again overhead. He pawed the ground once, twice, as though caught between fight and surrender. Ethan took a step closer, raising his small hands. The rain ran down his face in rivulets, but he didn't wipe it away. He whispered again, words only the horse seemed to hear. Blaze shuddered, his massive body trembling with the storm inside and out. Another flash of lightning struck, so close the ground shook, and the stallion bolted forward, straight at the boy. Thomas shouted, vaulting toward the gate, but he was too far. Ethan didn't move. He stood rooted, eyes wide open, arms reaching. Blaze stopped short, skidding in the mud, throwing up clumps of dirt. He lowered his head, chest heaving, and pressed it against Ethan's small frame, his muzzle burying into the boy's shoulder. The sound that came from the horse was not rage, but a deep, guttural groan, almost like grief. The ranch fell silent despite the storm raging around them. Men stared in disbelief, rain dripping from their hats. Evelyn pressed her hands together in prayer. Mary collapsed against the fence, sobbing with terror and relief. Ethan wrapped his arms around Blaze's soaked neck. "You're not alone. I won't leave you." His words were carried away by the wind, but the meaning hung in the air. Slowly, impossibly, Blaze stilled. His muscles unclenched, his body relaxed beneath the pounding rain. He let the boy guide him to the center of the corral, away from the broken rails. They stood together there, boy and beast, while the storm lashed the world around them. Thomas finally entered, his boots sinking deep into the mud. He stopped a few feet away, watching the impossible unfold. His voice, when it came, was thick with awe. "I've never seen anything like it." Ethan turned, still holding Blaze, his small frame dwarfed by the stallion. He just needed someone to stand with him. Lightning flashed once more, illuminating the two of them in a stark, brilliant light. The boy with his thin arms wrapped around the massive horse, and the horse who had once been a terror, now calm, leaning into the child as though he were the only safe place in the world. When the storm finally passed, the ranch was left broken. Rails shattered, fields flooded, debris scattered across the yard, but within the corral stood a bond forged stronger than any fence, stronger even than fear. Thomas knew then that nothing about their lives would ever be the same. The storm had passed, leaving the ranch soaked and battered. Broken rails leaned drunkenly, puddles spread across the yard like mirrors of a restless sky, and branches littered the dirt road. But in the center of the chaos, one image lingered in every mind. Ethan, drenched to the bone, standing unafraid as Blaze pressed his head against the boy's shoulder. By dawn the next day, the ranch was alive with the sounds of repair. Men hammering boards, cattle being herded back to safer ground, and dogs barking at the scent of overturned earth. Yet no matter how much work was done, no one could shake the memory of what they had seen. They spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices tinged with disbelief, as though to say it aloud would make it less real. Thomas carried the weight of it differently. He had seen storms break men, seen horses lose their minds in terror, but never, never had he seen a wild stallion surrender his fear into the arms of a child. The image haunted him, pressing against a truth he had avoided for years. Blaze wasn't just a horse gone mad. He was a remnant of the past, a living fragment of Emily's spirit. And now her son had drawn out something in the animal Thomas himself had never been able to reach. That evening, when the men retired to the bunkhouse and the yard quieted again, Thomas found Ethan sitting alone by the corral. The boy's sketchbook lay open on his lap, pages blurred where rain had smudged the pencil lines. Blaze stood nearby, calmer than Thomas had ever seen him, ears flicking contentedly as he grazed at what little grass poked through the mud. "You should be inside," Thomas said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Ethan didn't look up. "I wanted to make sure he's all right." Thomas stepped closer, his boots squelching in the wet ground. He leaned against the rail, eyes on the stallion. "He's tougher than he looks." "He'll be fine." Ethan finally glanced up, his eyes clear but questioning. "So why does he act like he's carrying something too heavy for him?" The words cut deeper than Thomas expected. He studied the boy, seeing so much of Emily in the tilt of his chin, the stubborn calm in his gaze. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then, as though the dam inside him had finally cracked, he lowered himself onto the rail and spoke. "There are things you don't know, Ethan. Things I should have told you sooner." His voice was low, weighted with years of silence. "Your mother, she was fire, just like you. She loved this ranch, loved the horses, but she carried her battles quietly. Blaze wasn't just any horse to her. He was a gift Ethan's brow furrowed." "From you?" Thomas nodded slowly. "On her 18th birthday. She'd spent years helping me with the colts, sneaking into pastures when she thought I wasn't watching. I gave her Blaze when he was a foal, said maybe he'd teach her patience, or maybe she'd teach him trust. For a while, it seemed like both Ethan's eyes widened. He turned toward the stallion, wonder filling his face. "So he remembers her." Thomas's throat tightened. "A horse doesn't forget." "Not kindness, not pain. When Emily left, she took Blaze with her. I thought I'd lost them both for good. I didn't know she had you, didn't know she was sick. I only found out when Mary showed up here." Silence fell heavy between them, broken only by Blaze's steady chewing. Ethan closed his sketchbook carefully, his small hands trembling. "All this time, you were my grandfather, and you didn't even know?" Thomas's voice cracked as he answered. "Didn't know. But I should have. Maybe if I'd tried harder, asked more questions, she wouldn't have carried so much alone. Maybe she'd still—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Ethan's lip trembled, but he held himself steady. "She used to tell me dreams were important. That they were how people we loved spoke to us after they were gone. I think that's why I dreamed about Blaze. She was telling me to find him, To find you. The words struck Thomas like a brand. He looked at the boy, his grandson, and saw not only Emily's eyes, but her belief in impossible things, her stubborn hope. And for the first time in years, he let the grief break through. He covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. Ethan hesitated, then slid closer, along the rail, placing a small hand on the old man's arm. It's okay. I found him. I found you too. Blaze lifted his head at that moment, snorting softly as though in agreement. The stallion stepped closer to the fence, pressing his muzzle against Thomas's shoulder. The old rancher froze, then slowly lowered his hands, staring at the animal with disbelief. For years, Blaze had only shown him rage, defiance. Now, as if carried by Emily's memory and Ethan's presence, he offered something different. Forgiveness. Thomas let out a shuddering breath. I've been carrying my own storm too long, he whispered, and it's time I let it go. The boy smiled faintly. That's what Mom wanted. For us not to be alone anymore. The confession hung in the air, binding man, boy, and horse together in a way words could never fully capture. The past had left scars, but in that moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't dared in years. Hope that healing was possible. And in the silence that followed, the bond between them deepened, unspoken yet undeniable. The ranch wore a fragile calm in the days after the storm. Repairs were underway, rails replaced, mud raked smooth, shingles nailed back into place. But beneath the sound of hammers and the lowing of cattle lingered a new kind of tension. The truth about Ethan had reshaped everything. The boy moved with a newfound sense of belonging. Sketchbook always under his arm, Blaze never far from sight. Yet behind that belonging was a shadow, the absence of his father. Mary avoided the subject, but Thomas couldn't. He knew the truth was only half told, and unfinished truths had a way of festering. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the plains in orange fire, Thomas sat at his desk, pen scratching across a letter. His words were blunt but heavy. You have a son. He deserves to know you. Come home. The letter traveled by train, carried across mountains and prairies, and in less than a week, it reached David Carter in Montana. A former Marine turned blacksmith, David had buried himself in work since leaving Emily years ago. He had not known she carried his child. The letter shook his world, his calloused hands trembling as he read the words again and again. 2 mornings later, the sound of a truck engine carried down the dusty road to the Miller Ranch. The men looked up from their chores, shielding their eyes against the glare. A weathered pickup rolled to a stop, and from it stepped a man tall and broad-shouldered, his hair dark but flecked with gray, his eyes shadowed by years of regret. He carried himself like someone used to command, but his hands twitched nervously at his sides. Ethan was by the corral with Blaze when he heard the engine. He turned, squinting, and saw the stranger step down. Blaze let out a sharp snort, ears pinning back, sensing the tension before Ethan could name it. Thomas came forward, boots grinding the dirt, his face unreadable. David, the man nodded, removing his hat. His voice was rough, strained. Got your letter. Evelyn appeared at Thomas's side, her expression cautious but not unkind. Mary lingered near the porch, her mouth tight, arms folded across her chest. And Ethan stood frozen, clutching his sketchbook, staring at the man as if trying to piece together a picture he had never seen before. David's eyes landed on him at last. They softened, then brimmed with something between wonder and sorrow. "That's him." Thomas's jaw clenched. "Yes, that's Ethan." The boy swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "You're my father?" David's breath hitched. He stepped closer but stopped short of the corral, his gaze darting from the boy to the stallion, looming protectively behind him. "I didn't know," he said quickly, desperately. "Ethan, I swear to you, I didn't know about you." "If I had, I never would have," his voice cracked. "I never would have left." The boy's face tightened, confusion and anger battling in his young features. "So you didn't leave me on purpose?" David shook his head fiercely. "No. Your mother never told me. By the time I found out, it was too late." The words fell heavy in the air. Ethan clutched the corral rail, his knuckles white, his eyes burning with questions too big for his age. Blaze pressed closer to him, the stallion's massive body shielding the boy, as though sensing the storm of emotions. Thomas broke the silence. "You've got a lot to answer for, David. But he deserves to hear it from you, not from anyone else." David's gaze returned to Ethan, raw with pleading. "I want to know you." "If you'll let me." The boy hesitated, then asked the one question that mattered. "Are you going to leave again?" David's throat worked as he forced out the truth. "Not if you don't want me to." "I'll stay, Ethan. I'll do whatever it takes." For a long moment, the boy said nothing. The ranch held its breath. Then Ethan turned to Blaze, resting his hand against the stallion's blaze of white. The horse snorted softly, eyes fixed on the man beyond the rails. Ethan whispered, "What do you think?" as if expecting the horse to answer. Blaze pawed the dirt once, then stilled, his gaze unwavering. Ethan looked back at David. "You can stay, but you have to prove it." To both of us, David's eyes filled, but he nodded firmly. "I will. I promise." From the porch, Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest, relief softening her features. Mary turned away, wiping her eyes before anyone could see. Thomas stood tall, his face lined with worry, but also a flicker of something else. Hope that perhaps the family he thought shattered might still be rebuilt. As dusk settled over the ranch, Blaze lifted his head and let out a long, steady breath, the sound carrying across the fields. It was as though the stallion himself had judged the moment, acknowledging the fragile thread being woven between father and son. For the first time in years, David Carter felt the possibility of redemption. And for the first time ever, Ethan Parker knew what it was to stand before his father and hear him say, "I will not leave." The days following David's return stretched long and uneasy, like fence wire pulled too tight. The ranch bustled with its usual rhythm. Cattle driven across fields, hay stacked in the barn, men calling to one another over the clang of tools. But beneath the surface pulsed an unfamiliar tension. Ethan was cautious around the man who called himself his father. David, in turn, was careful with every word, every step, as though afraid one wrong move might send his son retreating for good. Through it all, Blaze remained the constant thread. The stallion never strayed far from Ethan, his fiery chestnut coat catching the sun, his dark eyes steady and watchful. Where once the horse had been chaos, now he was anchor. And Ethan, though small against his massive frame, seemed to draw courage from him. One morning, Thomas called Ethan and David to the corral. Jake Turner leaned against the rail, his hat tilted low, his expression unreadable. "If you're going to stay," Thomas said to David, his voice rough but fair. "Then you'd better understand what your boy and this horse already share. And you," he turned to Ethan, "need to learn that trust goes both ways. Blaze listens to you, but he also needs you to guide him." David frowned. "He's just a boy." Thomas's eyes narrowed. So was Emily when she first learned. Blood doesn't measure age when it comes to horses. It measures heart. The boy straightened at his grandfather's words. He set aside his sketchbook, climbed the rail, and slipped into the corral with a confidence that still amazed the men watching. Blaze snorted once but remained calm, lowering his head as Ethan laid a hand on his neck. "Start with the lead," Thomas instructed. "No ropes, no tricks." "Just see if he'll follow," Ethan nodded. He stepped forward, speaking softly to Blaze. To everyone's surprise, the stallion moved with him, step for step, his hooves sinking into the dust in rhythm with the boy's small shoes. The ranch hands murmured among themselves, disbelief thick in their voices. Jake shifted uncomfortably, the memory of his own defeat burning sharper than ever. Thomas leaned on the rail, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. "Good. Now stop. See if he stops with you." Ethan halted. Blaze halted. Dust settled around them, golden in the morning sun. The boy's smile was small, but radiant. "He understands." David watched, his hands gripping the rail so tightly his knuckles whitened. He wanted to call out, to warn his son, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he realized the boy needed no saving. Not from him, not from anyone. Jake muttered under his breath. "It's just luck." Thomas's sharp glance silenced. "Him!" The next lesson came harder. Thomas instructed Ethan to change direction, to circle the corral. At first, Blaze balked, tossing his head, hooves striking the dirt. But Ethan didn't yank or shout. He waited, whispering softly, until Blaze's ears flicked forward and the stallion followed, uncertain but willing. Each step was a negotiation, a fragile thread of trust stretching stronger with every pass. By the time Ethan guided Blaze back to the center, both were breathing hard, one from effort, the other from awe. The boy leaned against the stallion's neck, his voice trembling but proud. "He trusts me." Thomas's reply was quiet but firm. "And now he's teaching you what trust means." David swallowed hard, his chest tight. He had come to the ranch expecting to prove himself as a father, but what he saw now humbled him. His son was proving himself without needing permission. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch steps, sketchbook open, drawing Blaze with lines more confident than before. David lowered himself onto the step beside him, awkward in the silence. After a moment, he asked, "What's he teaching you, son?" Ethan kept his eyes on the page. "That fear doesn't mean you run. It means you listen harder." David blinked, stunned by the wisdom in the boy's voice. He reached out, hesitated, then gently ruffled Ethan's damp hair. The boy didn't pull away. Not yet trust, not yet forgiveness, but a beginning. From the corral, Blaze lifted his head, ears flicking toward them. In the fading light, the stallion's gaze lingered on father and son, as though he too was teaching them. Lessons of patience, of second chances, of how broken things could be mended if given time. And for the first time since David had arrived, Thomas allowed himself a rare smile. Perhaps the horse wasn't the only one giving lessons on this ranch. Summer deepened on the Wyoming plains, the grasses tall and golden, the air heavy with the smell of dust and sun-warmed sage. Life on the Miller Ranch seemed to settle into a fragile rhythm. Ethan's laughter carried across the yard as he worked with Blaze. David's voice grew steadier each day as he tried to find a place in his son's life. And Thomas watched with a mixture of pride and unease. The stallion that had once been chaos was now the center of peace, holding the family together like a thread of fire. But peace never lasts long on land where survival is measured in dollars and cattle. One late afternoon, a stranger arrived. His truck rattled into the yard, its paint sun-faded, its bed filled with ropes and saddle gear. He stepped out in boots polished to a shine and a smile that never touched his eyes. Carl Whitmore, a horse trader known up and down the state for sniffing out profit where others saw problems. He had heard the rumors. A wild chestnut stallion, untamed by men but bonded to a boy. To Carl, that meant opportunity. He tipped his hat to Thomas, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Heard you got yourself a fireblood horse. A stallion with fight in him. Thought I'd come see for myself." Thomas stiffened. He didn't like Carl, never had. But hospitality ran deep in him, so he gave a curt nod. "You've heard wrong. He's not for sale." Carl's smile widened, the kind that made a man's skin itch. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Miller. Question's just the price, from the corral." Blaze threw up his head, ears flat, as though he recognized the threat. Ethan, who had been sketching in the shade, ran to the fence, his small frame bristling like a cub guarding a lion. "He's not yours," the boy said fiercely. Carl chuckled, feigning charm. "Kid's got fire too. But listen, son, horses like that, they're wasted on ranch work. With the right training, Blaze could fetch a fortune in rodeo, maybe even breeding stock. You'd be rich enough to never worry again." Ethan's eyes flashed. "He doesn't want rodeos. He wants to be here." The trader crouched, lowering his voice as if confiding. "Horses don't get to want, boy. People decide. And people pay." Before Ethan could answer, David stepped forward, his broad frame casting a shadow over Carl. "You'd best leave. Blaze isn't going anywhere." His voice carried the steel of a Marine, steady and unmistakable. Carl straightened, his smile thinning. "You sure about that? Ranch like this can't be cheap to keep. Accidents happen. Fences break. And a horse like that, well, he's more danger than he's worth. Think it over." Thomas's jaw tightened, his fists curling. "I said he's not for sale. You'd do well to be off my land before sundown." Carl tipped his hat again, but the glint in his eyes was darker now. "Suit yourself? But don't say I didn't give you a fair offer." He climbed back into his truck, the engine coughing to life. Dust billowed as he drove away, but the unease he left behind settled heavier than any storm. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the small room he shared with his aunt. His hands clutched the sketchbook to his chest, the image of Blaze's proud head pressed against the paper. He whispered into the dark, "I won't let them take you. I promise." In the corral, Blaze stamped restlessly, as though he, too, had heard the promise. His ears flicked toward the house, his dark eyes glowing in the moonlight, burning with a defiance that mirrored the boy's. The ranch slept, but the threat lingered. Everyone felt it, like a coyote circling the herd, waiting for the right moment to strike. And for the first time since Blaze had returned to the Miller Ranch, the family realized the fight to keep him had only just begun. The days after Carl Whitmore's visit carried an uneasy stillness. Though the trader's truck had rumbled away in a cloud of dust, His words lingered like a shadow stretching long across the yard. Blaze sensed it too. He grew more restless at night, pacing the corral, ears flicking toward every sound in the dark. Ethan slept lightly, often creeping out to sit by the fence with his sketchbook, whispering reassurances as though his voice alone could guard the stallion from being taken. Thomas knew better. Men like Whitmore didn't leave things alone. When money smelled this sweet, they circled back, and the ranch, already strained by a dry season and thin profits, would look vulnerable to outsiders. He saw it in the eyes of his men. Loyal as they were, they worried. Every broken rail, every lost calf was another nail pressing down on the ledger. On Saturday, the town held its monthly livestock auction. Ranchers gathered to buy, sell, and trade, the air thick with dust, sweat, and the cries of penned animals. Thomas never liked these gatherings, but he went all the same, if only to keep a finger on the pulse of what others were whispering. Ethan begged to go too, and after some hesitation, Thomas agreed. Better the boy saw the world's rough edges than remain blind to them. David came as well, uneasy in his new role, but determined to stand beside his son. Sure enough, Carl Whitmore was there, leaning against a rail with a cigar clenched between his teeth. His polished boots gleamed, his smile oily as he spotted the Millers. He tipped his hat mockingly, then raised his voice so others could hear. "That wild stallion of yours. Word is he's worth more than half this yard put together. Shame to waste him on sentiment." Heads turned. Whispers rose. Ethan stiffened, clutching Thomas's sleeve, but the old man's hand came down firm on his shoulder. "Ignore him," Thomas muttered. But he could feel the weight of every eye. Ranchers lived by profit, and sentiment was a luxury few could afford. The auction rolled on, calves sold in lots, mares led through the ring, bids shouted sharp and fast. But Thomas's mind wasn't on the sales. He was turning over Carl's words, knowing the man would keep pressing until something broke. That evening, as the family returned to the ranch, they found Carl waiting at the gate in his truck. He leaned out the window, waving a folded contract. "Final offer," he called, his tone sharp now. "I'll pay more than any man would dare refuse. Enough to ease your debts for years." "All I want is the stallion." Ethan's cry split the air. "No!" He ran forward, planting himself in front of Blaze's corral as though his small body could be a wall. Blaze reared, sensing the boy's distress, his chestnut coat burning in the last light of the day. Carl sneered. "Kid, you've got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't pay bills." His gaze flicked to Thomas. "You know I'm right. Think of your men. Think of the ranch. This is your chance to save it." Thomas's jaw worked. He felt Evelyn's eyes on him, heavy with faith. David stepped closer, his voice steady. "If you sell that horse, you don't just lose him. You lose the boy, too." Ethan's small hands clenched into fists. "Blaze is family. You can't sell family." His words trembled, but they rang through the yard like a bell. Silence stretched. Every man, every beast, seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Thomas stepped forward, his boots grinding the dirt. He stopped between Carl and the corral, his frame straight, his voice iron. "Blaze isn't for sale. Not today. Not ever. He belongs here, with the boy, with this family." Carl's smile withered. He spat into the dust, fury flashing in his eyes. "You'll regret this, Miller." Then he gunned the engine, the truck roaring as it tore down the road, leaving only smoke and threats in its wake. Ethan collapsed against the corral, tears streaking his dust-stained cheeks. Blaze pressed his muzzle into the boy's chest, breathing slow and steady. grounding him. Thomas placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, his voice rough with emotion. "You were right, Ethan. Family isn't something you sell." The ranch hands gathered nearby, silent witnesses to the choice that had been made. They knew the decision came with cost. Carl would not let this go, and debts still weighed heavy. But for that moment, in the fading glow of dusk, there was only the bond between a boy and his horse, and the family who stood united behind them. In the corral, Blaze lifted his head, mane whipping in the wind. His eyes gleamed, no longer with fear or fury, but with something fierce and loyal. He had been claimed, not as property, but as kin. The final choice had been made. The days after Carl's final threat brought a quiet resolve to the ranch. The air felt different now. Not lighter, not yet safe, but steadier. The choice had been made. Blaze would stay. And though that decision came with risk, it also brought a strength none of them had felt before. Ethan rose earlier than ever, slipping from his bed before the rooster crowed to meet Blaze at the corral. He no longer needed to call for the stallion. Blaze would already be waiting, his chestnut coat shimmering with morning dew, his dark eyes fixed on the boy, as though he'd been watching all night. Ethan would open his sketchbook, sitting cross-legged in the dirt while Blaze lowered his head, nosing the pages as if approving each line. David watched them from a distance, leaning against the porch rail. He had come to the ranch a stranger, uncertain if his son would ever allow him a place. But with each passing day, he saw the walls between them begin to crack. Ethan didn't call him Dad yet, but the way the boy sometimes leaned closer when David spoke, or the way his small hand brushed his father's arm without pulling back, told him the door was opening. One evening, Thomas gathered the family by the porch as the sun set fire to the horizon. The sky glowed with streaks of crimson and gold, echoing the blaze on the stallion's forehead. The ranch hands had finished their work and drifted toward the yacht bunkhouse, leaving only family in the yard. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "This ranch has seen storms and droughts, births and burials. I've made my share of mistakes, and I've carried them too long. But watching that boy with that horse..." His eyes lingered on Ethan and Blaze standing together in the corral. "Reminds me that family isn't about holding on to pride. It's about holding on to each other." Evelyn laid her hand over his, her eyes glistening. Mary wiped her face discreetly, though no one mistook the tears for dust. David stood taller, his jaw firm, as though he too was learning what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. Ethan stepped forward, his voice clear, though his small chest trembled. "We're a family because Blaze brought us together. If he hadn't come back, I might never have found you. So I think he's not just our horse, he's our gift." The stallion, as if understanding, lifted his head and let out a soft whinny that rolled across the yard like a blessing. He stepped closer to the fence, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder, then nudging toward Thomas and David. For a moment, it was as though he were binding them with his breath, weaving invisible threads between generations. David moved to his son's side, his large hand resting awkwardly but firmly on Ethan's back. "I left too many things unfinished," he admitted. "But I'm not leaving this. Not again. You have my word." Thomas's gaze softened, pride and sorrow mingling in his eyes. "Then let's finish what Emily started." Together, the family stood united in the fading light, a circle of faces etched by loss, but bound by newfound hope. Blaze stood at the center, his fiery coat glowing like a beacon, no longer the storm that threatened to tear them apart, but the flame that had drawn them back together. Later, as stars spilled across the Wyoming sky, Ethan sat once more with his sketchbook. He drew not just Blaze this time, but the family gathered around him, the grandfather with his weathered strength, the grandmother with her quiet faith, the aunt with her fierce protection, the father with his vow of return, and at the heart of it all, the boy and his horse, side by side, their bond unspoken but eternal. He closed the book softly, whispering into the night. "Thank you, Blaze, for bringing me home." The stallion lowered his head beside him, mane brushing the boy's cheek. In the hush of the ranch, with coyotes calling in the distance and the wind rustling the tall grass, the family finally felt whole. Whatever storms might come, they would face them together. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas Miller believed, not in luck, not in profit, but in the healing fire of a boy, a horse, and the family they had rebuilt. And so, Blaze was more than a horse. He was the fire that brought a broken family back together. If this story touched your heart, let me know by dropping a simple 0 or 1 in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because even more powerful stories of courage, love, and the bond between humans and animals are waiting for you in the next videos.